Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to today's webinar on knowledge management. Before we get going, let's just look at some housekeeping. So this is a listen-only webinar but is being recorded. We welcome your questions via the Q&A function. You may submit a question at any point throughout the webinar and we will then hold a Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. Simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel and post your question. If you experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issue via the Q&A function and our team will help you out. We'll send a feedback survey round after the event, and on completion of this, we'll forward you the presentations and recording of the webinar in due course. This is a CPD recognised webinar. Please request your certificate via the feedback survey following the event. So now for introductions. My name is Helena Barrell and I'll be facilitating this webinar. I work at BSI where I'm Committee Manager for our KMS1 Knowledge Management Committee as well as the HCS1-2 Human Resources Committee. We have two great experts joining us today who are both valued members of BSI's KM Committee. First we'll be hearing from Margaret Gare, who is Head of Library and Information Services at the Scottish Government. Prior to this, Margaret was for 10 years the Knowledge Management Lead in the Ministry of Defence's Information and Knowledge Services team. We'll also be hearing from Adrian Malone, who is Digital Engagement and Business Partnering Director at WSP UK, where he leads the UK Digital Programme. Adrian has 25 years worth of experience in construction and engineering and has been active in knowledge management for the past 20 years. So before I hand over to Margaret, who will be looking at what knowledge management is, I'll briefly introduce the new standard that we're focusing on today, BS 34401 2022 Knowledge Management Application of BS ISO 30401 Guide. So this is a new British standard that published in October. The guide was developed by the UK Knowledge Management Committee to provide additional detail and explanation to help UK organisations adopt BS ISO 30401, the original management system standard on knowledge management. The guide expands on the core concepts and requirements of ISO 30401, as well as offering case studies and sector-specific guidance for the adoption of a KMS. To aid the publication of the guide, the committee members have all collaborated to produce an executive briefing, which we'll be publishing very soon. This will be a free resource that concisely explains why the guide was produced and how it can help you. We'll send details of how to access this when it goes live, so do look out for that. And now I'll hand over to Margaret, who will get us started on the first session. Over to you, Margaret.
Yes, hello. As Hannah said, I'm Margaret Gare and I'm the Head of Library Services at the Scottish Government. So I'm going to talk a bit about what knowledge management actually is. And if you could move to the next slide, please. So before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what knowledge itself is. And I've started off with a quote there from the standard itself. Knowledge is intangible and complex. It is created by people. Knowledge management is a means of unlocking the potential value of knowledge. Knowledge isn't information, although it can become information. It resides in people. It's intangible. It's contained in people's heads, and it's based on experience, expertise, the know-how that we all accumulate through our lifetimes in work in our specialist areas, and it is continually refreshed as new knowledge comes in stream, as we acquire new knowledge from other places. It can be codified, and I've given some examples on the slide there of ways in which knowledge can be codified. If you're talking to people, things like exit interviews, after action reviews, post-project reviews, lessons learned exercises, handover notes, etc. It can be incorporated into, and it should be incorporated into, your manuals, your procedures, your processes, your guidance. Those should be being updated all the time as new knowledge feeds in. And it needs to reach the right people. And it must be accessible and it must be searchable, your codified knowledge. There's no point in just sticking it in a repository of reports and hoping people will find it. You have to find ways of making it searchable. But the key point is that knowledge, because it resides in people, can never be fully captured. So you must also socialize it. And if we move on to the next slide, please. So what is knowledge management? What does that mean? It's about connecting people to people to make sure that they can seek out and share knowledge, ensuring that anyone in an organization can share their own knowledge, can seek out that of others. And that means enabling them to connect with expertise internally and externally. So teams should be able to connect and share and learn from other teams. Individuals and teams should be able to network widely and seek and share knowledge internally and externally. So ensuring, first of all, that they have access to relevant communities and networks is absolutely key. And communities, they can be internal, they can be external, they can be professional, they can even be social, they can be communities of interest or practice, they can be narrowly focused, they can be broadly focused, but the point is making sure people have access to them and have permission to access them. You also need to connect people to your codified knowledge, and that means having some systems for doing that. You know, just a reports repository isn't really enough. Going back to what I said about having the manuals, the processes, the procedures, and making sure that they can find and access and update that codified knowledge. You need to ensure that knowledge is actively sought, shared, adopted where possible. You know, knowledge is about finding out if somebody's done something already and not reinventing the wheel, but saying, can we just lift that? Can we adopt it straight, or adapting it? You know, taking an idea and then adapting it to suit your needs. If you do something from scratch, sharing that knowledge where it's possible to do so. And it needs, as I said, to be refreshed and to be reused. You need, therefore, to do all this, you need to facilitate it, you need to incentivize it. So good knowledge management, as the standard makes clear, should address the issue systematically at policy, strategic, and tactical levels. There is no point in doing knowledge management for the sake of it, just saying, right, we're going to do some of these activities. You need to align them with your organizational objectives. People need to understand why knowledge management is important to the organization and how it contributes to the organization's outputs and how it improves the organization's outputs. So you need, first of all, a policy, and that policy should be aligned with your objectives. You need a strategy to implement knowledge management. Again, just going straight in and saying we'll do some knowledge management activities is not really going to get you there. So you need to have some strategic objectives and goals. And then you need the tactical level. You need people on the ground. If it's a small organization, you might have maybe 1 or 2 knowledge managers. If it's a large organization, you might have an overarching strategy, but you then might have lower level strategies at divisional level. And you need the right roles and the governance to enable you to do that. So the whole, we're talking about knowledge management system. We're not talking about an IT system. We're talking about the whole management structure to get a knowledge management culture in place. So that means you need to have the right roles. You need governance. You need good governance. And you need leadership. Leaders need to lead by example, because when you think about knowledge residing in people's heads, we're all individuals, we're all different, we all have different motivations. So you need to incentivize the right behaviors, and that means leadership is really crucial. You need senior level, a champion or champions who lead by example and encourage others to do this. You need knowledge managers, you need facilitators, because capture knowledge and codify it, you need to get it out of people. So facilitation is a very key knowledge management skill. You need to be talking to your system architects so that you can see get hold of the codified knowledge and make sure people can share it. And you have to address the overall culture of the organization and make sure people feel that they should be sharing their own knowledge and feel that it's safe to go and seek knowledge from others. So that's basically a very quick overview of what knowledge management is. So I'm now going to hand over to Adrian to talk more specifically around the standard and its implementation.
Thanks, Margaret. Really great introduction to knowledge management there. And what I'm going to go on and do is talk a little bit about how the guide can help organizations, large and small, in all different sectors, to implement a knowledge management system, or indeed to take a knowledge management system that is existing and refine and improve and assess and evaluate that knowledge management system to check that it's working well for your organization. So I'm Adrian Malone, as Helena said, worked in various roles across the construction and engineering sector for the last 20 plus years. And a lot of that time, not necessarily by role title, but certainly by activity, has been very much focused on knowledge management and collaboration. So we can go to the first slide, please. So this section is all about how we implement the standard. So just a little bit of a recap. The standard itself, as Helena said, is BS ISO 3041, and then more recently a British standard, BS 34401. So the numbers are quite similar there, so easy to mix up. But 34401 is the guide to the application of the standard, and that's what we're focused on here, and that's what we focused on in terms of the executive briefing, which is going to be coming soon on the BSI website. So the standard sets out the principles and the requirements of a knowledge management framework. It gives guidance to organizations wishing to optimize and to embed that to generate value from knowledge, as Margaret's already talked about, and it provides the basis for audit and improvement. The guide is a really good place to start if you want to implement or improve your knowledge management system. It provides additional case studies, and I think one really important point is that it provides case studies which are tailored to the UK market and to lots of different types of organisations in different sectors. So it's a really good place to start to understand and get some advice and some input in terms of what knowledge management could look like or should look like in your organisation. It provides a more detailed description of the core knowledge management concepts and draws out that important link in terms of behaviour and culture. And that's something that both Margaret and myself are going to really draw upon, because it's a key piece that separates knowledge management from information management. A lot of it is about that culture and about those behaviours, which then drive that knowledge sharing and the creation of shared understanding within organisations. So that's what we're talking about when we say how we're going to implement the standard. We're talking about these two documents here. And if we could just move to the next slide. And what I'm going to do, first of all, is just draw your attention to something you'll find in both the executive briefing when it comes out and also in the guide itself, which is there's a set of 8 guiding principles which have been defined, which can really help you in terms of that knowledge management journey, help you to understand what knowledge means and how you manage knowledge in your organization. So I'm going to talk about 4 of them in a little bit of detail, and then the other 4 a little bit less so, but I want to kind of draw out just the first 4 in particular. And the first one is around the nature of knowledge. And as Margaret's already said, knowledge is very much something that's embedded in people. When knowledge is created, it's always created by people. It's always created in intangible form. So yes, we can take knowledge and we can codify it, which means we can write it down or we can capture it in some form. But when we do that, we essentially turn it into information and we lose some of the context and we never fully capture that knowledge. So knowledge starts out intangible. It starts out as a kind of something that people create. Now, guess I have to bring up at this point, I'm sure a number of people are thinking, with all the stuff that's in the news at the moment about chat GPT and generative AI, we may at some point reach the point where that statement is challenged. But right now, even with those tools, and there's some fantastic technologies out there, even with those tools, they're essentially taking stuff that's been created by people and then reassimilating it, albeit they're very powerful in terms of the processes they use to do that and how they can support creativity, etc., etc. So we start with this basis that knowledge starts off in people, it's intangible, and that means that we have to think about knowledge management and our knowledge management system much more broadly than just a technology solution. And the risk when we talk about a knowledge management system is that we immediately jump to the thought that this needs to be some kind of technology, some kind of database, some kind of web portal or what have you. So technology is important, and we'll come on to that. But as Margaret said, we need a much broader, much more rounded understanding of the nature of knowledge. So knowledge can exist in lots of different forms. Yes, it can exist in a tangible form in terms of documents, in terms of knowledge embedded into processes, for example, and Margaret's given some examples of those. But knowledge also exists as experience, as something that we share between one another when we collaborate, when we engage, when we engage in learning, for example. And actually, some knowledge exists in a very, I guess, unconscious form in terms of things like muscle memory. So, when I think about this, if I think about a composer, for example, just as an example here, creating some music, then they're able to take the idea that they've got, take that music that they're creating, which is very much an internal process, and they can capture it in terms of musical notation. But that musical notation never captures everything that was in the mind of the composer. It can't possibly do that. And equally, a pianist, for example, reading that music can look at the page, they can see that notation, and they can internalize that and turn it into something they can play. But they're then drawing upon their experience, their years of learning, their muscle memory in terms of then how their fingers move, their hands move, how their feet move on the pedals, etc., in terms of how they then turn that back into a performance. So there's lots going on there, and all those same things go on in organizations when we're collaborating, when we're working together to deliver outcomes. So that's quite a philosophical place to start, isn't it, in terms of the nature of knowledge. So let me bring it down to something that's a little bit more practical, a little bit more tangible, and a bit more focused with the next two of those guiding principles. So the first one, value, and the first of those two, value, and the second, focus, are really important. And Margaret again already introduced this idea that a knowledge management system should not exist for its own sake. When we design a knowledge management system, when we implement that, when we look to improve that over time, we need to constantly be asking the question, what does value look like for this organization? And sometimes that'll be very commercially focused type things in terms of sort of efficiency, productivity, etc. But there's also a whole bunch of intangible value that we can think about as well that would be relevant to all different types of organizations and all different sizes. So we start by asking, what does value look like? What does value mean in this particular organization that we're working in? And the guide to the standard provides some really good examples that's worth looking at around this. And as Margaret said, we need to start by thinking about what value looks like, and then how we translate that into the strategic and the tactical objectives of the organization or of the team. And that's where we need to focus. So that third piece about focus very much intertwines with value. We need to understand what drives value for the organization, and then we need to focus on knowledge management activity to help to enable the organization to achieve those outcomes. So knowledge management should not exist as an end in itself. I guess there's some very specialist organizations where the organization purely exists to create knowledge, and that's a sort of slight outlier to what I just said. But very much when we're developing a knowledge management approach, we need to think about the organization strategy, the organization objectives, what drives value, and then we need to focus in on those things in terms of the the tactics that we deploy, the strategies we deploy, how we develop the framework to focus knowledge management on supporting those things. And that leads me to the fourth of those guiding principles, which is, certainly I recommend, the guide recommends taking a very much adaptive approach to implementation and improvement of a knowledge management system. And what we mean by that is, first of all, as I said already, every organization is unique in the sense that there's a unique context, there's a unique culture, there's a unique strategy for that organization. And so the knowledge management approach needs to adapt to that context to make sure that it's intertwined with the organization and its outcomes and its objectives and how it operates. And I think also, we don't need to go for one big bang implementation around knowledge management. Often it's better to start small and incrementally improve. And the guide sets this out as part of implementing a knowledge management system or growing and improving a knowledge management system. Then start by picking a number of priority areas, focus in on those, develop them, make sure the right measurements are in place to make sure that you can identify, are we being successful? Are we having the impact that we expected in terms of making this investment, be that resource or money or what have you? So be adaptive and very much make sure that you're in tune in terms of measuring that you're achieving the results that you expected. So they're the four principles that I really want to focus in on in a little bit of detail. The other four then for me kind of flow out of that, which is if you get those four right, then you've set the foundations really to start to think about shared understanding. So when teams come together, and there's countless examples of this, you can issue a document, issue some information, provide a team with some information, and each team member will take away a slightly different meaning or a slightly different understanding from that document, or we can all attend a meeting and come away with slightly different views of what was discussed and what the outcome of that meeting was and what the next action should be. So shared understanding is something that's really important to focus on from a knowledge management perspective. And how do we make sure that we've developed that shared understanding in a team? So when we leave that meeting, when we leave that workshop, when we go off and take action afterwards, that we're heading in the right direction, in the same direction. And there's a number of things we can do from the point of view of a knowledge management system to support that. The environment is really important, and by that I mean the working environment, but also this leads into culture. To a certain extent, it also crosses into the technologies that we use. So when we build a technology solution to support knowledge management, when we create an office space, when we create a collaboration space, we very much need to be thinking about how do those environments, both physical and virtual, how do they support a knowledge sharing organization to kind of form and grow. Margaret's already picked out in terms of culture being hugely important. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And as I said when I was talking about the adaptive principle, an iterative approach is often the best way because it allows us to learn, it allows us to see what works in our organization. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the years as I've implemented knowledge management in a number of different organizations or taken the next step in terms of knowledge management in a number of organizations where something already existed, is that it would be nice to think that there was some kind of template, some kind of guide that just says do these 5 things and it'll work in any organization. But because of that adaptive piece, because each organization is unique, because we want to align knowledge management with what value looks like for the organization, then that there isn't that kind of painting by numbers approach to knowledge management. And therefore an iterative approach allows us to try things, test, see what works, and still be focused on measuring success and setting ourselves some hard outcomes and some hard objectives and some hard measures, but making sure that we're learning, that we know where we want to get to, and that we're learning and measuring as we go. So that's the guiding principles. If we could just move forward to the next slide, please. And this piece I just wanted to draw out again. There's information in the guide around this, but the guide sets out and the standard sets out 5 knowledge management enablers. So again, when you're thinking about a knowledge management system, it's important to think about those 5 enablers and make sure that you've got, as part of your framework, as part of your strategy, you've got things in place to address each of them. So the first is governance. Margaret's talked a little bit about this already. Governance is hugely important. It's about making sure that you've got the right roles, the right accountability set up, but that you're embedding those in the way that the knowledge management system operates within the organization. It's about thinking about the measures and the metrics. It's about thinking about, have you got the right processes in place? Have you got the right investment and resources in place, and the right governance strategy in terms of making sure that knowledge management is going to be successful and thrive in your organization. So governance is an important piece, and as part of governance is that important piece about leadership as well. Roles and responsibilities, roles and accountabilities are a key enabler. It's important to think about who or where the accountability for knowledge management sits in an organization. It will be different in different organizations. I've worked in organizations where knowledge management was part of the IT function. I've also worked in organizations where knowledge has been part of the professional, technical best practice part of the organization. Sometimes it sits within the HR function, for example, picking up much more on that kind of cultural and kind of learning piece. So thinking about where knowledge management sits now for organizations of a certain size, then it's likely that there will be a dedicated team to manage the knowledge management system. But in some organizations, certainly in smaller organizations, that might not be the case. It might be that knowledge management is an accountability within a role or within a team that's got other priorities as well. And that's fine. Again, that's that piece about not taking a one-size-fits-all approach. So roles and responsibilities are really important, thinking about where knowledge management sits, but then also thinking about the responsibility for supporting the knowledge management system right across all the roles in the organization, and how do you embed that? So how do you make sure that project managers or you know, kind of others in the organization are embracing and engaging with the knowledge management system, are seeking to learn before they take action, are seeking to reflect and to share back that learning after taking action. So that's an important piece as well. Talked a little bit about process, embedding knowledge into the knowledge management system and the framework into the processes of the organization is important. A model that I've used in the past outside of the guide that we produced, but I often think about knowledge as being within the flow of what somebody's doing within their role. And if you can keep those knowledge processes in the flow of the activity that the team is focused on, rather than asking them to stop and kind of break out from what they're doing and go elsewhere to access a knowledge management system or to engage with the knowledge management process, then you're more likely to get buy-in and engagement for that. And knowledge management is not about technology. It's not the same thing as information management, but technology and infrastructure is important, particularly in larger organizations where you need people to collaborate who can't be in person. But also there's some great technologies out there to help teams to collaborate, help teams to capture and share and understand knowledge, and help to generate that shared understanding, for example. So final enabler, the fifth enabler, is a little bit different to the other four, and the guide sets this out quite well, I think, which is culture. And culture cannot be directly managed. So culture is diffuse and complex. You can't manage it directly. It's not this linear thing where you can identify a culture you want to embed in an organization and then go and do 6 things to achieve that. It's very much emergent as a property that comes out of the leadership, the communication, the stories that are co-created within the organization. And again, the guide provides some useful information and advice in terms of how culture can be addressed as part of a knowledge management system. So that's the 5 enablers, and a little bit about those guiding principles. If we can move on to the next slide, and what we want to do in this next section was just to kind of break out from the kind of presentation style that we've been in up until now. So I'm going to bring Margaret back in, and what we want to do here was just to share some stories, share some experiences that we've had, some additional thoughts around some of the points that we've we've kind of raised on the webinar so far. And maybe as a starting place, Margaret, one of the things that that I've thought about, and sorry, I meant to say at this point, after this section, we'll move to the Q&A. So just as a prompt, if you haven't already posted questions in the Q&A function, please do so. We'll be picking those up in a little while in the Q&A section. But just before we get to that, so one of the things that I talked about, and I think is crucial to understand when we're thinking about a knowledge management system, is the role of knowledge as an enabler. So both Margaret and myself have said this, that when we implement a knowledge management system, it's not an end in itself. It's very much something where we want to enable, support the organisation in achieving its wider strategic and tactical outcomes. So Margaret, I was just interested in your thoughts and your experience in terms of where you've seen, how you've seen knowledge management sit in the organisations that you've worked with, and how you've seen knowledge act as an enabler, or perhaps not, in those environments.
Yeah, well, I think in my previous role at the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Defence is a very, very large organisation, and it has a number of different, I suppose, subcultures sitting within it. You've got the four branches of the armed services. You've got a commercial arm. You've got a project management arm. You've got all the civilian civil servants, and everyone is aligned to the overall objectives of defence, which is the defence of the realm and contribution to peacekeeping activities, etc. But all those cultures have their own objectives as well. So in terms of a knowledge management system for the Ministry of Defence, we had a policy and we had an overarching defence strategy, but we recognised that the different branches of the ministry would have different local objectives, and they would have to implement the overarching strategy in ways that suited that and that aligned with those objectives. So we were quite loose in our approach to, we didn't take a very dictatorial line about you must do this, you must do that, you must do that. We said, here are the kind of overall principles that we want you to adhere to, here's the policy, but go away, come up with your own strategies, your own ways of implementing them. And we had tools, we produced tools that helped them do that. We had an assessment tool, we had implementation improvement plans that they could use. But it is really important not to be too rigid in your imposing a top-down knowledge management system. You need to get everyone in the organization engaged, and that means the leaders, that means the desk level, that means the middle layers of management, understanding why the sharing and seeking of knowledge is really important. And if you want to progress as any kind of organization, you need to be able to find knowledge. You need to be able to find out what other people are doing, what other people have learned. You need to share the knowledge that you have. You need to be able to go to your colleagues and say, what you can help me with this. What do you know? How are you doing this? And one thing I think we didn't quite draw out yet is that knowledge is not just about what. It's not just about training people. It's about how and why as well. It's the context around things. What do you do? How do you do it? Why do you do it that way? And is there a better way? And that's about the seeking knowledge and finding out what people have done to innovate and to make things better. And we had some failures in defence, as all knowledge management systems do. And in a huge organisation like that, there were people who were resistant, but we also had some real successes where people were forming communities, being very active in those communities, talking to each other, sharing information. And where I am now in the Scottish Government, I mean, just one example, very recently, and Adrian was talking about ChatGPT. My team is developing some awareness training around ChatGPT, and by using our Yammer social network. We've been able to find others around the organisation who are looking at the same thing, and we're forming a little working group to collaborate and make sure that we're all on the same hymn sheet and aligned with the objectives of the Scottish Government. So there you go, Adrian. I'll hand over to you. So I think you want to, you might have something to say on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you know, I think that piece about not just the what in terms of knowledge, but the why and the how is something that's really important and easy to miss, because we think about knowledge as being this thing rather than being a process of generating that shared understanding. And I think for me, there's a really important piece to draw out from that, which you know, is also talked about in the guide, which is about in an organization where you're implementing it or refining a knowledge management system, to really understand what we describe as your working definition of knowledge is. So what is your working definition of knowledge in the organization? And that links to that guiding principle around focus as well, about choosing where to focus the effort. You know, I've certainly seen knowledge management programs in the past that have fallen into the trap of defining knowledge as really being information, about being lessons learned, without really understanding the broader context of those lessons, or how those lessons then change the way that people work, go about their activities in the future. So I think, you know, making sure that you've got that broad definition, working definition of knowledge is really important, and understanding what that means in terms of how that knowledge fits with the organizational imperatives, the organizational outcomes, the strategies, etc., at all different levels, and making sure we don't miss out on that human-to-human sharing, which is enormously important, and certainly something that I've seen. You know, technology's now reached a point where you know, we can connect, we can find people in our organizations and outside of our organizations. We can connect with them both face to face, which is always great in terms of the richness of communication, but also there's plenty of other means that we can use to collaborate person to person and team to team as well. And Margaret, when we were talking in the run up to this webinar, one of the things we talked about was that piece about lessons learned, and about whether lessons learned amount to lessons identified. Can I just maybe share a little bit about that conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I have been in lessons learnt exercises where they have been lessons identification. They are not learning lessons, they are identifying lessons, and people often see this as a key part of knowledge management. Oh, we must learn lessons. We've all heard it. We've seen public inquiries over the years. We must learn lessons from these disasters that have happened or whatever. And often the lists of lessons are identified, but to learn lessons, you have to go the next stage. You look at the lessons you've identified and you go, right, how do we then implement these lessons? How do we take the knowledge that we've gained from this program of identifying the lessons? How do we take that and then shift it into the organization to improve things? What do we need to do to apply the lesson, to validate the lesson, to apply it, to improve things? And that's the next step that sometimes isn't taken in lessons learned exercises. Would you agree, Adrian?
Absolutely, and kind of just jumping forward a bit in terms of thinking about some of my experiences. You know, the opposite end of the spectrum is those very much people-to-people type sharing. And just one really quick story, because we're getting close to the Q&A session. But an organisation I worked with a number of years ago, and I can't take credit for this. This was something that was in place when I arrived, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. Was that I think it was every Thursday there was a coffee morning, and the way it worked was coffee was at 10 o'clock. If you were going to go to that coffee session that Thursday, you would go down beforehand and you would put your mug onto a hook, and everybody had a hook with their name or their kind of badge against it. So what it meant was that I could come downstairs, put my mug up on the hook and see that, oh, Margaret's going to be here today. That's great. I was going to ask Margaret about this project or this piece of work. So I go back to my desk and get the drawings, get the documents, get the backup information and bring it down to that coffee session, and we'd meet up and we'd have that conversation. And for me, that was just a really nice kind of people-focused knowledge management strategy. So I think it's important to, we often think about, when we talk about standards and we talk about knowledge management systems, we have to talk about big initiatives, big interventions within organizations. But actually, sometimes it's the really small things which can start to influence that culture and start to influence those behaviours. And just I guess the final point before we move into the Q&A. Again, Margaret, before this session, we were talking about the importance of leadership and about the incentivization of behaviours. And perhaps if you could just sort of talk briefly about that, and then we'll bring Helena back and we'll move into the Q&A. So there's 3 mentions of the Q&A. So again, if you haven't got the questions posted up, pop them in the Q&A function.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the guide does draw out, as Adrian said, is the importance of the culture aspect, which in the standard itself is a little bit buried in one of the annexes, but that does not mean that it's not really, really important, and the guide brings that out. And I think the thing about culture is you can't really, if you start thinking, right, I'm going to change the culture, we need to change the culture of this organ to move it into a knowledge management space, you'll fail. Because, as we've said, knowledge resides in people. People are individuals. People have different motivations and factors. So what you're thinking about really in terms of changing a culture is more shifting behaviours and incentivizing and motivating the behaviours that you want to see in the organisation. So it is about making people feel that it's safe to share knowledge, making people in particular feel that it's safe to share mistakes, because that can be a real barrier to learning and to gaining new knowledge. People feel, if they fear that they're going to be sanctioned for mistakes, or they're going to be picked on or mocked or something, then they won't. So the culture, the leadership piece is making sure that people feel that it's safe to seek and share knowledge. And again, seeking knowledge as well. People sometimes think, oh, I've been given this task, I must do it. If I, Margaret, go and ask Adrian for help, I'll be seen as weak and having failed my task. So again, you've got to incentivize that kind of culture that says, no, it's fine to go and ask Adrian for help because he's done this before. He knows he can share what he's learned. He can share how he's done this, and it will save time and effort in you starting from scratch on something that you don't really need to start from scratch on. And it's making people also feel that there's something in it for them, because people will hang on to their knowledge sometimes on the grounds that knowledge is power. I know all about this. I'm the expert. I am therefore indispensable, so I'm not going to share my knowledge. You've got to find ways of incentivizing and motivating them to do that, and there are different techniques you can apply to try and get that culture. But think of it as I would say personally, I don't know if Adrian agrees, but I would say think of cultural shifting as incentivizing behaviors to shift the culture, not in terms of we must dictate to people that this is the culture we want and you will do it.
I would definitely agree that we can't dictate culture, and absolutely encouraging those right behaviours is an important part of that. I think the only thing I would add is that I think it's also about creating those shared stories, or creating the space for those shared stories to emerge. Again, you can't really control what those stories are or how they're interpreted, but they do tell you what's happening in terms of the culture of the organisation. So thank you, Margaret, for those points. It's probably time for us to move to Q&A unless you've got one final comment. I think I interrupted you there.
I was just going to say, I think in terms of uncovering those stories, when I talked about the importance of communities, and your coffee cup story, that kind of social activity can be really good for uncovering stories and incentivizing behaviors, because you can relax a bit more in a social setting, and you can get to know people a bit more in a social setting and make those professional connections more easily. So I think having some sort of, or allowing some type of social activity, socially focused activity or social communities is quite important in getting knowledge management out there, as well as your professional communities.
I agree, and I think it links us back to that guiding principle of environment as well, and why environment's so important in terms of knowledge.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Helena, I'm going to bring you back in, and I'm hoping that we've stimulated lots of interesting questions, hopefully not too challenging for you to ask us on behalf of the audience.
Yeah, thanks both. That was a really great conversation, really informative. And yeah, we have actually received loads of really interesting questions, so I'll get started on those. So one question that we received prior to the webinar was relating to ChatGPT, which I know you've already touched on a bit so far, and they basically wanted your thoughts on what its impact will be on knowledge and training.
Do you want to start with this one, Margaret?
Yeah, well, it's a very fast-moving environment, ChatGPT, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it. I think, start off with the positive side of it. I think it does, AI and ChatGPT generally does have some potential for uncovering codified knowledge. For the crawling technology, for going through, say you do have a repository of reports, let's say something the Ministry of Defence might have would be accident reports. There's a potential for using AI and ChatGPT to go through those and make connections that you might not be able to make just by reading through a series of reports, just digging deeper in and going, oh, this happened in this accident, that accident, there's a common thread we need to find out. So I think, it does have some potential, particularly in the codified knowledge space. But there are at the moment quite a lot of issues with it, with its reliability, with the data that it's scraping. I mean, if you can take it and apply it inside an organization, you've probably got a bit more control. But in terms of finding external knowledge, I would say I have some reservations, and Adrian, I think you probably do as well.
Yeah, again, I certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert in generative AI or any type of AI, but certainly it's something that I'm looking at and exploring as I'm sure everybody is at the moment. And yes, it's an incredibly powerful tool. I think it's like anything, it's important, any technology, it's important to understand how it works and what the limitations are, and where that tool, that technology could be applied in the most useful way. So absolutely, as a starting point of pulling together the publicly available knowledge that's formed the training set of that tool, that's a really powerful, really useful thing. It goes way beyond what we've been able to do in terms of just usability, in terms of sort of search engines, and also the piece around sort of generative images and also generative coding is really interesting for me in terms of helping programmers to learn to code. My son's kind of going through that process at the moment as part of his education, and just having those tools available. And I think back to me in the same path 20, 25, 30 years ago, none of that was available at that time. It was very much relying on books and kind of friends at that point in time. So I think there's some real value to the technology. Again, it's just understanding how that training set's being formed, understanding the potential risk of bias in those training sets, understanding how to use that tool in the appropriate way, in the appropriate context. And the final thing I'd say is it then comes back to then testing the assumptions, testing the understanding that you've gained from using those technologies by speaking to people who've got expertise and experience in that context, and just validating that. But it's certainly a useful tool to use as part of that process.
Great, thanks both. So another question we've received during this webinar is, one attendee's asked, could you give an example of intangible knowledge being aligned to the organisation's goal and being used to drive strategic objectives?
That's a good question, really good question. Do you want to pick that up, or do you want me to pick that one up, Margaret?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example.
Let me jump in with something then. So I think it's interesting because when we talk about intangible knowledge, just as a reminder, that's the stuff that hasn't been codified, hasn't been written down. And certainly from the work that I do, one of the so I tend to work with it's kind of broad framework, and there's lots of different versions of this notion of sense making. So a lot of my work is around the digital space. A lot of my work is around using data, using analytics, using big data, using digital tools to generate insight that can kind of be drawn out that data. Sometimes using AI tools to help us to find that in terms of machine learning, but using that data to generate insight. And then I always make a distinction between insight and actionable insight. And for me, what actionable insight means is that we've found something that's interesting. That's I'm curious about that. Something, a pattern in the data or some information that I hadn't spotted, I wasn't aware of previously. But you then need to test that against experience, and that's where that intangible knowledge comes in. And you need to test it against that experience to make sure that then the choices that you are making strategically or tactically, based on those initial insights from the data, are the right ones for your organisation, or as right as we can identify at the time. So I think that kind of sense-making piece of bringing together codified knowledge in the form of insights from data and insights from kind of search, etc., but then combining those with expertise of people who've walked that path can really help to make sure that you keep that alignment, you keep that context in the organisation, and keep the organisation on the right path, or the strategy on the right path based on that. And often it's very easy for us to see things in the data that look right, but actually when you then put it in front of somebody who's been there before and walked that path previously, they can very quickly spot the errors in that or the mistake in that.
I think I completely agree with everything Adrian said there, and I think an example from let's say go back to the Ministry of Defence, operations in the field. You can be briefed and you can be prepared for operations in the field, but when you get out into theatre, it's like a map. If you look at an Ordnance Survey map, you see all kinds of things marked on the map, but what the map doesn't tell you is, are there bears? Are there lions? Is there a flood? You don't know that until you get there. And the Ministry of Defence in operations has a very defined process for sharing knowledge as from outgoing teams with incoming teams and briefing them so that they can capture that knowledge that's been gained in the field and pass it on to the new teams in a handover exercise. And that's kind of an example of aligning your knowledge management techniques with the organizational objectives. The organizational objective in this instance is to make sure that the incoming team is as well briefed and as ready as it can be for the operation that they're about to step into.
Yeah, it's a great example. And can I just share one more, which just occurred to me when we were talking, Margaret, which is some years ago I used to run an operational help desk team. So we were running the maintenance operation for a client that had a kind of assets across the UK, and we had stacks of data. We had an IT system. We tracked something like 200 different measures constantly in terms of performance. But actually, I would sit down, on a regular basis, so almost on a daily basis, with that help desk team, who were talking to the engineers who were going out to the jobs, who were talking to the customers that were ringing in with the issues. And I did that because they had they often generated the best insights in terms of what was working well and what wasn't, because they were dealing with that every day. And it was only when you asked them the right questions that you drew out that kind of intangible knowledge that was embedded in that team. You wouldn't have got it just by asking them to fill out a form, for example. And I think, again, that's the importance of that piece about conversation and interaction and human-to-human sharing really draws out some of those kind of key lessons or key experiences that you can then act upon.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about right throughout history, if you think about, say, apprenticeships, the apprentice doesn't just learn by reading books. They learn from the hand of the master, their apprentice master, and they're showing them, they're passing on their knowledge. They're saying, okay, this may be how you've shown to do it, but I've found a better way of doing it. So intangible knowledge, you need to find ways of making those connections with people as well as just recording it. You know, you cannot record it completely. We cannot share everything we know, even on a very narrow subject. You know, experts, even a deep expert can still learn from other people. New knowledge is coming on tap all the time. You have to have those personal connections.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll try and squeeze a few more questions in. So one question we've received is, since the end of lockdown, many organisations are working in a hybrid fashion. How does the standard reflect these challenges, specifically how tacit learning can now prove more challenging?
That's a really interesting question, a very, very pertinent one as well. And I guess to a certain extent, it goes back to that piece about working definition of knowledge, goes back to understanding the environment. There was a piece of research I was involved with a number of years ago that was looking at for different types of activities, for different types of communication. Actually, sometimes it's better to be face-to-face, but there are certain activities where actually it might be more helpful not to be physically in person in a room with people, where, for example, you need to go away and reflect or think about, and you might want to kind of rerun the conversation or reread the information. Sometimes actually being offline works better. And I think there's a whole bunch of evidence that's emerging around how different environments work less well or more well, if that's the right way to phrase it, for different types of people as well, and how people prefer to collaborate. So I think that probably thinking about hybrid or not hybrid, face-to-face or kind of in person, might be a little bit of a kind of a misdirection. I think really what we need to understand is, it goes back to that piece that I talked through in terms of the principles. Understand what knowledge means for the organization, understand how knowledge can generate value for the organization, understand how it links to those objectives, and then understand what's needed in terms of the environment, the process, and the kind of methods of communication, which then allow that knowledge to be shared and generate that shared understanding. So I think actually the guide doesn't perhaps directly address hybrid working, but all those principles are absolutely the right things to be thinking about in terms of forming a well thought out strategy in that space.
Brilliant. And yeah, I don't probably run out of time to answer any more questions, but thank you everyone for posting those through, and thank you so much to Adrian and Margaret for delivering those really great presentations. So I'm going to wrap things up there. As mentioned, attendees will receive a copy of these slides after the webinar upon completing the feedback form. And on the right hand side of this slide, if you click through to that link, you'll be able to access the standard we've been discussing today as well. So yeah, again, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Margaret and Adrian for your presentations, and to everyone in the audience for joining us and submitting such interesting questions. Goodbye, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Thanks everyone.